Sahana Vavatu Sahano Punuktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Astu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us, may that one nourish us both. May we work together with great energy. May our studies be illumined. May we not unnecessarily argue or cavil with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So tonight or today we are celebrating really three events. One is the birth of Adi Shankaracharya, the great philosopher of India, the great proponent of the non-dualistic system. Also that of Ramanuja, who also was a great philosopher, social reformer, and he also represents one approach in philosophy. Not necessarily Indian philosophy, general philosophy in how we approach things. And then, of course, a third school is there that is represented by, well, we could traditionally say Madhva. However, this happens to be the feast of St. Mark the Evangelist. And Mark the Evangelist was taking a Christian approach based on St. Paul's version of Christianity or encounter with Christ, and is necessarily a dualistic system that identifies myself as an individual wanting some salvific value from a being who is separate and higher, metaphorically speaking, than me. Some supreme authority that I can relate to, in this case in the person of an incarnation called Christ. So it happens that these three are converging today on the same day. Now you see, when we talk about these philosophical approaches, we should never really let go our common sense view of things. The ultimate Indian system of non-duality proposed by Adi Shankaracharya is very special because the vast majority of people will relate to a loving creator God that we can relate to. About even probably 90% even of the people in India will have a dualistic temperament. But that doesn't mean to say that some of us may not sometimes find a non-dualistic tool that we can work with. In some contexts, we can use it. It's like a toolbox. We can approach it from a position whereby I feel I am separate. It's a natural feeling. And then I can approach something that is other than me and develop a sweet relationship with it. So that there's a certain sweetness. And the example is that I don't want to become sugar, or I don't think I'm sugar. I want to taste the sweetness of sugar. But you'll find that the non-dualistic tool, if you consider it something like a tool, can be useful. It can be part of a toolbox. As with any tools, supposing your car breaks down, you don't want to use all the tools. You select the right one for the right context. And so all these philosophical doctrines and approaches become useful because if we are faced with an obstacle or problem, we have to learn to shift our viewpoint and see it from a different point of view. If we stick just with a standard point of view, it will be difficult to solve the problem. If we feel that we are being assaulted by life in general, it either can comprise attitudes of people or difficult circumstances provided maybe by natural phenomena, or it might be a certain bereavement, which is a difficult thing to get through. So we don't have to crash against a closed door. We can move our perspective, shift our perspective and see, Can we look at these things from a different point of view? For example, death. Can we take death as a full stop or a continuum, just a part of an adventure in a series of birth, life, and death? Can we take it in that way? Can we look from a different standpoint? And probably there are various ways in which we can progress, as I say, without crashing through a closed door and banging our head. We should have the ability, if we know these different approaches, to gently shift from one point of view to another until we find a settled solution to our difficulty. And so all the tools are useful. But the non-dualistic tool, it's hard to imagine how it can be useful at all. Because Swami Vivekananda, as he was as Naran, who made fun a little bit of this non-dualistic position. Non-dualism says there's only one thing. There cannot be more than that one. It's exactly as it says. It's Advaita means there are no two things. Then he said, you mean this cup is God, this plate is God, this floor is God? He was making fun of it. Now, Sri Ramakrishna, of course, his master, was a very wise teacher. And he picked up a text on non-dualism and said, can you please read this? Yashtavakra Gita, I think it was. And Vivekananda, or Naran as he was reviled by that and said, I don't believe in all of that, Never mind, just read it for my sake, please. So anyway, we kind of have to ask, could there be a situation where we can imagine from our present standpoint how this non-dualism can be objectively true and useful to us? Could there be a situation like that, or are we only fancying it? And of course, the doubt will come about its usefulness. So let us take an example from modern science. In modern science, we are faced with the idea that if we take a reality simply as Democritus, the Greek philosopher, took it, that there is an atomic world made from matter, nothing else, then we can see that in modern times we can break that atom open and we get radiation. And we can verify that by simply taking a simple atom and splitting it, exploding it, and an invisible thing called radiation is there. And that doesn't prove then that if a carpenter wants to make us a table, that we have to talk in terms of radiation. No, we have to shift our terms, we shift our references and say, well, you take a piece of wood of this kind of quality and make something of this size. So for our ordinary sense-bound view of the world, when we're dealing with the things in the waking world, we can imagine this, because the whole of non-dualistic system is based on these three phases of consciousness. That's its conclusive argument. That this world that we live in is a waking world, and when the eyes shut, and when the ears close down, the inner senses that are perpetually running take over. They continue. We call this a dream. And when they set, according to a passage of Kathopanishad, then there's another reality which is there. We have a vague understanding of it, but we know in retrospectively that it is peace. Even during it, we are aware of it. And the peacefulness comes because there are no two things. Non-duality produces peace. Can we now resort to an area of peace within us that will allow us to shift our perspective and solve our difficulties and problems? You say, I'm an honest person. Why do I run into difficulties? Every day I seem to be running into difficulties. Things are difficult. What is it that puts the obstacle there? Is it necessary there? Is it actually there? Or is it something like the atom that when split amounts to a kind of radiation? And modern science more and more will tell us this is not what we think it is. The world that we see is not really what we interpret it as. We are living life through a mistaken view. And if that is true, how can we shift that? And if it is, this mistaken view is technically called avidya, that means ignorance. But it's not a lack of knowledge in the ordinary sense. It's not an intellectual thing. It is simply means that we are looking through the world or through the mistake that the world is as we see it, as we hear it, as we relate through the senses, and as we interpret it through the queen bee of it all called the mind. Wherever the mind goes, all the senses go with it. If we can control this mind, will that help us in a practical way in dealing with all these obstacles? Is the world exactly as I find it now? Is our question. In this context, are there other viewpoints where the resistance that we find now won't be felt? So that's a tool for knowledge. And its application in daily life will be, if we apply it, will our position be verified? Can we test it out? So the non-dualistic position also uses the causal connection for some areas of argument. Causal connection means that the effect is intrinsically present in the cause. Whatever we see, whatever we understand, is like waves in an ocean. The cause of a peak of a wave is that's hollow, and the peak of the wave causes the next thing, the next hollow. And so really, cause and effect is difficult to distinguish. The effect is really just the more concretized version of the subtle cause. But you see, from a philosophical point of view, we can say that the material and efficient cause is one and the same. That makes a difference to the way in which we look at things. And so this causal connection can be used even by the non-dualists for some areas of argument. That something has been created, but you see at the last moment we can take it away. The idea of causation or creation, we can take it away and find the non-dual reality, the absolutely perfect, standing there full and free. The same person who can say, I own this body which is old, or I own this mind which is sometimes has got, shifts in it, memory, good memories, bad memories. Either person who is connected with this body-mind complex can be interpreted and felt and verified actually to be the non-dual ultimate principle. And when that standpoint is there, what becomes of the rest of what we see, the objective world, so-called? It is like we can look at something through a telescope. We can look at the stars through a telescope. But we can look at the telescope itself, and we can also look away from it. We have three basic options. If you think that a star is exploding and it gives you a problem, well then you can see how are you looking at it through the telescope. Take the telescope away, the phenomenon also disappears. Now it's not blanking off the problem, not at all, because the practical opposite side of it would be we take this world as a relative reality, not an illusion, by the way, relatively real, relative to a reference point, reference to my senses and my mind, reference, the stars are there in reference to a telescope, I can look through it, but I can look at the telescope also. I can also look away from it. These are the three states of consciousness. Now, supposing that I take this ultimate tool of non-dualism, how will I view the world? Will it disappear? No. It'll still be there, no doubt. But you see, it will still have this causal connection in relation to that segment. When I look at it as a witness, I'm not part of that segment. I can stand separate as an independent witness, and I can see this in front of me as a kind of game, as a kind of sport. And so a person who studies this non-duality properly would take this world as a game or a leader or a sport. That means I can adopt a sporting attitude. I have nothing to fear since the cause and the effect are the same thing, and there's only one thing being displayed. If I'm convinced of that, how will I convince myself of that? So Adi Shankaracharya had a solution. And the solution was really in line with his making a whole renaissance of the religious environment that was there in his time. He was able to see the world around him. He lived during maybe the decadent part of Buddhism in India, and so-called Hinduism was beginning to reassert itself, but the true leadership was lacking. And so what was called India was honeycombed with conflicting sects. We can identify these things in 6 varieties, of course. Classically, they come under 6 headings and still are there. And one of them would be what's called Purva Mimamsa, which is to do with stressing scripture, stressing rituals and mantras and so on and so forth, this ritualistic active part, thinking that you'll get freedom, which is the mutual goal of all the philosophies, through this way. Vaisheshika Nyaya were to do with logic, atomic theory and logic and so on, and Sankhya Yoga with the other kind of philosophies. And Sankhya has something useful for all of them. It brings about this idea of the nature of nature itself with its threefold property variety, which we call gunas, and this concept of the cause and the effect are the same thing. Many, many things can be taken without contradiction, but the final conclusion is incomplete. And then in contrast to all of that, of course, we have this Vedanta. But the Vedanta has these 3 approaches. One is called dualism. We can express it in Christian language. See, I pray to the Father, as Jesus said. Then Jesus also said, I am the vine and you are the branches. And so that's a kind of semi-dualism or semi-non-dualism, whose final conclusion is, I and the Father are one. These are not contradictory conclusions. These are supplementary positions. We can't take an isolated one. Now, the champion of this Vishishtadvaita or qualified non-dualism was Ramanuja. Shankaracharya would have lived probably in the 8th century, let us say about 700 of this current era. We're not certain. And with all of these great characters, there's a hagiography with all of these 3, St. Mark and Ramanuja and Shankaracharya. There's a hagiography which goes with it. What does that mean? It means that a few centuries afterwards, somebody constructs a story about their birth, and part of that was Shankaracharya was obviously something like a child genius, no doubt. He died very young, age 32. Ramanuja lived on to be probably around about 80. Of course, the hagiography says 120 years he lived. But, you know, there were big fans of Ramanuja who wanted him to live longer than his 80 years. But scholarship will say, no, probably about 80 years. Both of them were reformers. Both Ramanuja and Shankaracharya were reformers. And St. Mark, in his own way, was also a reformer. Because the very earliest texts that we find in terms of Christian Gospels was Mark's Gospel. Now, Mark doesn't begin with any birth, doesn't begin with any hagiography. Mark begins with baptism or initiation of Jesus. And it's clear that John the Baptist is an apocryphal messianic figure, and Jesus is continuing the legacy. And the whole messianic movement grows and develops from that. So we don't know who St. Mark was. Tradition, of course, says that he was John Mark, possibly a companion of Paul and Barnabas, I'm not sure. There were several of them, several Marks. And so tradition says this is the author of the gospel. So the author of that traditionally as Mark, and we know that his gospel was very basic, and we know that the other synoptic gospels, for example, Matthew and Luke, took all his text, copied it, revisited it, revamped it to suit their story, and took another source, most scholars would agree, another source, and combined that. So in a way, Mark also represents a basic form of dualistic Christianity. And if you read Mark as a first primordial gospel, you may have a different take, a different approach, a different view on Christianity, which is very much in line with St. Paul's teaching, and maybe not so much in line with his successors, Matthew and Luke, and John, of course, is a non-synoptic gospel. So this is one approach, and in that sense, he brought a renaissance, really, to the basic Christianity that maybe Jesus may have taught. But Ramanuja, of course, who lived probably around about the 11th or 12th century of this current era, and he was taught, his teacher was a non-dualist, following the interpretation of Shankaracharya. And Shankaracharya was, in the midst of all these ceaseless activities, found time to write small philosophical treatises, and many of the treatises and material that are attributed to Shankaracharya, probably he didn't write, but one thing we're sure, he wrote some masterly bhashyas or commentaries on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Brahma Sutras or the Vedanta Sutras, and there's one other text that he would have done, the Upadesha, thousand teachings, really translated means, and that we are pretty sure he wrote. Even the Viveka Shunamani that is attributed to him may not well have been written by him. Over 300 things he was supposed to write. I'm sure he never had the time to write in his 32 years, all that. But what he did write was revolutionary and scholarly. Revolutionary in the sense that he was bringing the Vedic tradition back into as a foundation, a stabilizing foundation. And so Ramanuja was taught by Yadava Prakasha, who was a scholar, and who was also following this Advaita Vedanta philosophy. But sooner or later, you see, the Vaishnava tradition was there strong, and Ramanuja had some disagreements with his teacher. He couldn't interpret some of the texts, for example, the Chandogya Upanishad, where Shankaracharya would interpret a certain text, the Lord's lotus eyes, something like a certain part of the anatomy of a monkey, something like that. He recoiled from that and said, no, the interpretation will be like the rising sun, a sun-filled lotus. And so they would have disagreed on a number of things. And so he rebelled against Shankaracharya's interpretations and wrote his own commentaries and bhashyas on these important texts. And yet, he wasn't exactly a dualist. He probably followed what was called Veda. Now you see, for practical purposes, the Vedanta philosophy is such that there's no error. We don't go from error to truth, as Swami Vivekananda puts it. We go from truth to higher truth. It's a plus system. We don't deny anything. We just put something on the top until we come to a final conclusion. And if that final conclusion is not just academic, but is practical, then that's a beautiful thing. And so Ramanuja, who's born in Tamil Nadu, of a Brahmin community, and so on, he made a great contribution. Now there's a a man called Keith Ward, who's a former professor of theology at Oxford University. He had studied Ramanuja. He's a clergyman of the Church of England, but has written many books and studied widely. And he sees Christianity as a Visheshtadvaita Advaita system. For all practical purposes, we have to use it. We can't deny the reality of the world. When you look at these systems, you don't really see any great generalized differences. You can see differences in approach depending whether you put your foot on the first rung of the ladder or the third or the fourth or the highest point. You'll find that each one may well be necessary because, as I say, we have to shift our view and get around the obstacle nicely. And so that's what he did. He was critical of that, and he was very sympathetic to the Bhakti movement, which was already developed, and he was more followers of the Vaishnavite Alvas, the great saints of Bhakti. And so he writes his commentary from that point of view, and Madhva on dualism writes his commentary. And so we know that the canon of the Vedantic texts will really be these three things, Prasthanatraya, that is, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, and the Bhagavad Gita. And yes, we can interpret them, all these three texts, in different ways. And also, of course, these Brahma Sutras gives us the opportunity to systematically present an approach. You know, Shankaracharya was very clever at dialectics. He was a great debater, a great reformer, a great debater, but there are some myths in connection with his life, in connection with the way we view him in the West and in the East. So one of the great misconceptions regarding Shankaracharya's philosophy was that he discourages the performance of duties and advocates a discipline of non-action for the realization of truth. But Shankara's position regarding action and the performance of duties, well, his position is the nature of Atman, or the soul, is existence, knowledge, and bliss absolute. Ramanuja takes these as qualities, as properties. And it's the very embodiment of peace, desireless, perfection, truth, beauty, infinity, eternity. And on account of Maya, or mistaken point of view, ignorance, Maya is really very badly interpreted as illusion. It's not an illusion as such. It's just a mistaken notion. It's neither existent nor non-existent. And so the primary example that Shankaracharya has, of course, is the famous snake and rope mistake. We step out in the twilight of the day and we see something coiled and we immediately mistake it as a snake that is dangerous to us. And when we investigate it properly, we see, no, it's a rope that is coiled up. What was the mistake? You can't blame the poor rope for it. You can only say, my misconception was there. And what was the mistake due to? It was due to my wrong interpretation. My eyesight was not correct. And so when I put my eyesight aside, that is, there's a separate object there, I will see it in its right context. Now, the point is, the rope must have always been there, if you use this analogy. And it was mistaken because I always understood the form. And so the substance is always there, according to Shankaracharya. It's not that the world is not. It's not that the snake is not. Something is there. Something is always there. And he used this argument really against the nihilism of Buddhism. Certain schools of Buddhism he would put as nihilistic, whether justified or not, because no, something is there. And that something is evidenced in the world. So that when we look at the world, we can pick up all the clues about what the substance looks like. Some other examples given. A clay pot. Well, clay is clay. If you ask a pot and give it an individuality, who are you? The egoistic pot, assuming it can speak, of course. This is a speaking pot. We say, I'm a pot. Who made you? Creator made me. When will you die? Well, when the pot becomes useless and broken. When will you reincarnate? You see, all these questions are irrelevant if the pot says, I am clay. I am clay, I was clay, I'm clay now, I'll always be clay. I am the substance. And the substance can be molded, of course, into different names and different forms. And these names and forms will be varied and different. You can take clay, you can make it in the form of a figurine, or a pot, or any other kind of ornament, or you can make it that it is just raw clay. But clay is clay, the substance is a substance. There's no such thing as gold and the ring. And the substance is always the same thing, and the form and the name will change. That means there's no such thing as death, and there's only one constant, eternal entity, if you look at it this way, projected as it were. The example of the snake and the rope, something is projected. And so this is a kind of adhyasa, this is a kind of superimposition, a projection, something like that. And so all we have done is we have forgotten our true nature, and we find ourselves entangled in this relative world with this mistaken notion, and we are entangled in it with ideas of morality, of good and evil, pain and pleasure, life and death, and all these what we call pairs of opposites. From the cradle to the grave, the unillumined soul engages in ceaseless action, striving to shun evil and realize good, assuming that an adjustment always has to be made because there is a hollow within us. But the realized person will increasingly understand, no, there are no gaps, no hollows, no defects, no deficiencies. It is all full and free. It always was. It is the eternal substance. So activities are influenced by love and hate, attachment and aversion, these different contrasts. And we hope to experience through action infinite internal happiness, happiness being our central goal. And we're looking for it in the external, the outside world. So we roam around aimlessly in what is called samsara, this world of change, and this world of becoming and rising and falling according to the results of our actions. But only gradually do we discover the impossibility of attaining abiding happiness through work associated with I consciousness and desire for results. If we put these two aside, then we will find this enduring happiness. So it's not that we don't work. It's that we simply put aside, as we work, I consciousness. We are simply learning that whatever we do, all our activities are instrumental. This is an instrument through which the divine is working, moving hands and arms and heads and eyes, shifting the drama scenery around. That means we can take this world as a kind of game with all its activities. That means that we can deal head-on all the activities without crashing through them, but taking it with a good-humored attitude. Such a person will have a sense of adventure. Come on, like a game of tennis, as I always say. Instead of saying, Lord, Lord, save me from the tennis ball, we say, no, 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 give us your hardest shot, please, and send it to the corner. I'll return it. I'll practice this 1,000 million times until I can learn how to do it. And then let's try the other corner. But let's not play an easy game, which will be very boring to watch and very boring to play. And a game which is a salvation game, Lord, save me from your war, becomes a game of fear. It's not a game at all. It is a nightmare. All these balls whizzing at you, the IBM instruments there saying so many kilometers an hour. What kind of game is that? A service that I cannot return? No, let me do it. So such an attitude, understanding a unity of existence, is there. And Swami Vivekananda understood this principle in scientific terms and inquired about it. Can we see that energy is one, matter is one, everything is one? You want to prove that there's a unity of existence only there. That is the highest non-dualistic position. And with these, he writes or he delivers his Jnana Yoga lectures. So that is the first misunderstanding. Of course, the liberated person goes back and engages in the service to humanity, having had all his activities reduced necessarily to a minimum, having understood or having detached himself or herself from this ego consciousness, this actor prophet syndrome, now engages in activity for the good of mankind, for the good of humanity. But the activities, of course, are quite different from those of an unillumined person. He's free from the I consciousness. He's free from longing for results, which bring tremendous anxiety. The second misunderstanding about Shankaracharya is that he was a staunchly loyal to the non-dualistic ideal of Brahman, the ultimate principle, or the absolute, that he is an enemy of the gods and goddesses of popular religion. And undoubtedly, of course, he held the ultimate reality to be beyond name and form and to be of the nature of pure consciousness. But he also stated that the direct method for realization of Brahman is not worship, but the path of knowledge, if you want a direct avenue. Indirectly, a worshipper of God, for example, will go to what is called the cosmic mind, the personal God, called Hiranyagarbha, or in mythology or the Puranas, called Brahma. But this is this cosmic consciousness. If you're a follower of Jesus, it'll be a cosmic Christ. Follower of Buddha, it'll be a cosmic Buddha. Follower of Ramakrishna, the cosmic Ramakrishna. Whatever it is, cosmic consciousness is there. The great Christian paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin was a French paleontologist. He learned these ideas, these Eastern way of thinking, and writes such wonderful books such as Phenomena of Man, or the divine milieu also, recognizing the divine play of things. So I don't think Shankaracharya was against this indirect way, I should say. From his point of view, it was study of scripture. Now, study of scripture, there's a technique. You hear it, Shravana, you reflect on it, Manana, and then you meditate profoundly on it until a kind of realization comes, and you use all the resources around you, such as teachers, and you apply viveka, a discernment. Neti, what is the truth? It's not this, it's not this. And then that results in a renunciation of the world, because you understand that what is in front of you is not permanent. This is called vairagya. So these are the basic disciplines from Shankaracharya's point of view. Ramanuja has a different point of view. Ramanuja tends to say that there should be a love of God. His philosophy will say, let me have temples, let me have worship. He initiated temples also. And of course, the Vaishnavite order prior to Ramanuja was already there. And he was not averse to people from other castes. So in that sense, he was also a social reformer. But you see, his philosophy was qualified monism or non-dualism. It's called Vishishtadvaita in the Hindu tradition. His ideas are one of the 3 sub-schools that I've mentioned. And so his epistemology, that means, this knowledge, how do you know what is happening, was what we might call hyper-realistic, or similar to a kind of naive empiricism. I know what is in front of me. I cannot deny what is in front of me. And the first 2 sources of knowledge are perception and inference. They're trustworthy. And notwithstanding the general human subjection to beginningless ignorance, knowledge is always of the real, and even in dreams. What I experience, I experience. I cannot deny it. I can't just dismiss it. And so all of this is there, but of course it's an error. It's a disordered perception or faulty inference concerning what is really there. And in saying this, I can hardly distinguish between Shankaracharya's position of the world and Ramanuja's in a sense. I mentioned Dr. Keith Ward. He writes like this, and I'm coming to Mark's Gospel also, but more than that, Mark's was the foundation. But the profound conclusion in terms of the Christian writings was in John's Gospel. He begins not with a birth or anything, but a transcendent position. In the beginning was the Word. We find almost parallel passage in the Rig Veda. Vak was projected from Brahma and so on. So in the beginning was a word, logos, nous, a cosmic mind, and that became flesh. It dwelt amongst us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You see, when we say the Word, Christians mean Christ, and that means Christ is God. Now, Keith Ward points out that in various passages in St. Paul's letters, about over 20 of them, I mentioned this, by the way, at a talk I gave at Trinity College on the Golden Rule. And I mentioned that Keith Ward had pointed out that in over 20 passages, St. Paul writes, we are part of the corpus or the body of Christ. Well, if Christ is God, we're parts of God. Ramanuja's position is we are parts of that. We're not, we are separate, no doubt. And ultimately we realize our oneness, no doubt. But for the time being, let us pursue things as a separate, as a sense of separation, and engage in worship, no doubt. We are not fully separate, nor are we fully united. And that's our experience, and we live with it. And then we have to say, well, the final realization will be this unity that is beyond description. And so, according to Ramanuja, the greatest good consists of knowing our true nature and of knowing the true nature of Brahman, moksha, same as everybody else, or spiritual liberation. And so, in a sense, it is a kind of non-dualism also. But you see, this spiritual liberation is seen as the joy of contemplating Brahman rather than release from life, death, rebirth cycle. And the joy is a result of devotion, praise, worship, contemplating the divine perfection. It is a sweet path, no doubt. Knowledge of Brahman consists in liberation. For Ramanuja, mainly because of the character of Brahman, not of the essence of Brahman. So he writes like this. Entities other than Brahman can be objects of such cognitions of the nature of joy only to a finite extent and for limited duration. But Brahman is such that cognizing of him is an infinite and abiding joy. It is for this reason that the Shruti, the scripture, says, Brahman is bliss. This is Taittiriya Upanishad he's quoting. Since the form of cognition as joy is determined by its object, Brahman itself is joy. And so Ramanuja is explicit in holding that theoretical knowledge of Brahman's nature will not suffice to procure freedom. The remedy to be employed is what he calls bhakti yoga principally. And no doubt this is the path for the vast majority of people. The discipline of devotion or worship. So for Ramanuja, moksha or freedom is not a negative separation from transmigration of series of rebirths. That's not that. But rather the joy of contemplating the divine perfection. And the joy is attained by a life of exclusive devotion called bhakti to Brahman, singing his praise. And of course, this Brahman in the Vaishnavite tradition is identified with Vishnu. So this is Ramanuja's point of view, contradicting, no doubt, how he was taught by his teacher and rebelling against his teacher's understanding. Now, of course, Ramanuja, Madhava and Shankaracharya, they all wrote these wonderful bhashyas. And it is very beautiful to study these bhashyas which are existing without contradiction. I mentioned 3 misunderstandings in connection with Shankaracharya. So he's not denying the existence of deities. Even he writes theistic hymns. He never permits one to forget that Brahman alone is the foundation of all relative ideas, and that the effulgence of pure consciousness radiates through the vesta of name and form. A clay plot is still clay, but the name and form also can be admired. The devotee catches a glimpse of the Absolute through the form of the personal God, who is the highest manifestation of the infinite, that a finite mind can comprehend on the relative plane. And Shankaracharya is empathetic enough to say, here, have some devotion. He climbs down, as it were, from his high non-dualistic position and says, for the good of humanity, please maintain this personal relationship. It is interesting that in the 4 maths or monasteries that he established throughout India, north, south, east, west, Dwaraka, and Joshi, and Puri, and Sringeri, and in all these maths, the worship goes on until midday. And yet they're teaching this non-dualistic philosophy. So Shankaracharya initiates even the worship of Shakti, or the Divine Mother, in his monasteries. One mistake might be that he was a Shaivite. No, because you see, in his opening prayers of praise, it is Vishnu that he's praising in the form of Govinda and so on. And he writes this beautiful, beautiful hymn, Bhaja Govinda, and so on. Then you see the 3rd misunderstanding of Shankaracharya, and this has come from Western critics, is that he moved away from the teachings of the seers of the Upanishads. And they contend that he held forth an optimistic and affirmative view of life, whereas, that was the Upanishad point of view. And Shankaracharya, they say, through his doctrine of Maya, would describe the world as a snare and a delusion, something to be gotten rid of. But this is not Shankaracharya's position at all. You see, it's without foundation. It's Shankaracharya's everlasting glory that he points out through unimpeachable reasoning. And his reasoning is like this. His dialectic method is to point out the position of the people he disagrees with. In his arguments with Jains and Buddhists and so on, he points out their point of view first, an objection in the form of an objection, and then he meets the objection with his own point of view. And this is what made him a superb debater. So, of course, he may interpret some texts in a non-dualistic way that Ramanuja, for example, may disagree with. Anyway, Shankaracharya takes every opportunity to insist the true essence of man and the universe is existence, knowledge, and bliss absolute. It's only when the individual sees a difference between Brahman and himself and the universe as well, because there can be only one thing. If there's a universe, you can't have a universe separate from Brahman if you declare there's only one thing. And so he acknowledges this. And if you find this distinction between Brahman and the universe, then the universe becomes an opportunity for you to be a victim, to be fearful, to have suffering and misery, to be subject to an interpretation of reality that this universe is. And so the characterization of deluding names and forms as Maya and the injunctions to renounce the unreal as a means to realization of truth are not new ideas of Shankaracharya's. Both are explicit and implicitly put in the Upanishads. But you see, I point out this. The other side of it is there can be only this one game. This is a play. If we take this philosophical view, we will enjoy this universe presented before us. And so I mention very often Raynor Johnson, his book called Imprisoned Splendor, although it's an old book written some time ago. He puts this idea, he knows that an atom will yield to radiation, and he goes on in his book to discuss the conclusions of chemistry and biology and psychology of the academy type, parapsychology even of Duke University, their experiments and so on, and goes on to explore mysticism and so on. What Swami Vivekananda in his Raja Yoga says, criticizes scientists for not exploring these avenues, for simply dismissing it, as they still do today. And so he comes to this conclusion in the chapter, Significance of the Whole. And he raises the question, well, not exactly in the words I'm going to give, but if there is an ultimate principle, which is an imperishable unity, an impenetrable unity, then how is it that we find this world of misery here? And what can you do from this world to become that? Being caught up in this body-mind complex, a body that is sure to perish one day, how can we attain the truth? How can we get from becoming to being, pure absolute perfection, immortal and so on, from which all things seem to be starting? How can we bridge this gap between these two positions? So naturally he asks, what can I do from this end to become that? And then he says, and I quote, at this particular position, the only way to get some help, some hint as to what could be the actuality, will be the Indian theory of Leela, sport. Only at that point is it useful. And Leela means sport, something like a play. So I always use this example, quoted from him. In the Shakespearean play of Hamlet, the famous Shakespearean actor Irving plays the part. At no time does he ever mistake himself for Hamlet. So you can't ask a question, what can Hamlet do to become Irving, the actor? There's no business becoming Irving. He is Irving. It's Irving playing the part of Hamlet. You can't say, what will I do in my role? My body-mind complex ego to say, what can I do to become that, to become the absolute? It is the absolute that is the actor. It's an irrelevant question. What can I do to become the absolute? No, you're that. You're already that. Shift your position and understand it. There are no two in the non-dualistic perception. Irving has not become Hamlet. He is playing the part. It's a game. There's no need for Hamlet to become Irving. He is. Where you see Hamlet and shake his hand, you're really shaking Irving's hand. It's the same thing. Nobody else is there. No two. So we find any question, when will I see God? From this non-dualistic point of view, when will I see God? When will I get my freedom? All these are irrelevant questions. How will I get from here to there? Irrelevant questions. You're not traveling anywhere. You're that. And repeatedly it's there. Tattvamasi, thou art that, thou art that. So the famous poem that is Shankaracharya's, that is adapted from that and put out today. Who am I put, as an adaptation of what Shankaracharya puts. Student asked one night to one with face of wisdom's light, "You see, I am not the wind-blown mind." It's a beautiful expression. The mind is so vague, so has full of vagaries, shifting here and there like the wind. You can't predict where it will go next. I'm not that. I'm not the mind. I'm not the wind-blown mind. I'm not the changeful intellect that changes its mind so often. I'm not the fragile ego that can be just wounded so easily. You look at me in a funny way, I get offended and tears start flowing. Why are you looking at me like this? What have I done wrong? Such a fragile ego. So normally this ego may strut proud. It has various sensitivities, either hushed or loud, go or stop. No, you can replace it with a shift of attitude. I am that, I'm that, I'm the Blessed Spirit, I am that. And by the way, I apologize for the sound problem earlier in the guided meditation, but this was the theme of it. I'm not the earth. I'm not connected with the earth. The earth is a resource. And a resource is something that is useful. Food is useful. It's useful if I'm hungry. If I'm not hungry, it's not useful. I can take another thing. I'm not gold, I'm not iron, I'm not any of the minerals or the sky. There's no birth in me, no death in me, no social status or caste. I'm not lucky or fortunate or unlucky. And I don't have a father and mother. There's XY chromosomes, genetically it's there, but the essential, substantial me, no. No father, no mother, no birth, always there, no properties. I'm simply there. And the nature of that is existence itself. So beyond fanciful flights and devoid of form, yes, I'm beyond all of that. And permeating through the living limbs of all, I'm not denying the limbs. I permeate through them and they move. I'm not bound. I'm not bound by a set form. I'm malleable. The form is malleable and I remain the same. And so therefore, I don't fear bondage or the world, for I'm not bound. I'm free already. And I always was free. I was always free. There wasn't a time, if you put it in a time frame like that. So I am free. This was an adaptation of Sri Shankaracharya's poem. So this is the shift that we are looking for. And if we take this world as a game, as a sport, well, we might say then that we will replay it all the time. It's worth seeing the match, the game. We don't want to do away with it. There's a misunderstanding. We don't want a fast ending to the game. Or either one stroke, we can take it, and that's enough, and we'll learn from it. And when it comes to winning the trophy, I can't go and show my hand if I'm playing a game of weakness. If I really play the game, I deserve the trophy. Repeat this 1,000 times until you understand it, till all the knowledge comes to me. Strike hard, I'll take it, would be the attitude of the non-dualist. Therefore, it becomes abhaya, quite fearlessness, cheerful. The greatest difficulties that this tool will be useful for, and the more acute the difficulty, the more we can take the stance and be optimistic. Not only optimistic, but we can play with great, great joy this game, which is there. We won't see it as a threat. So that's not our experience normally. Evidently, you and I are separate from this principle, and we have to attain liberation. Yes, that's not an invalid stance. But when things get tough, for practical purposes, you can adopt that, and then you are separate from one another, from the ultimate principle. So there's a becoming necessary at that point, no doubt. So there is a place for duality, and there's a place for qualified non-duality as well, and there's a place for absolute non-duality. Non-dual system doesn't contradict duality because we can play the game. And when we play the game, we can play the game of duality with this non-dual background all the time with us, this understanding. So we can take things if they are useful to us, but they're only useful to us in certain contexts. Duality is only useful in certain contexts. But the non-dual tool is a multi-purpose tool that we can use for every occasion if we have a mind to it. The real nature of mind is not a blank. When I'm hungry, I can take food. That's valid. But it can't be a basic attitude that God is a fool and made an incomplete world for us to correct, making holes for continuous filling. And so we come to a conclusion about it. You are an estimating principle. You carry out meditation, no doubt, by some technique, by some kind of peculiar inward poising that is there. And got the thing to work, stood back, then estimated it. That is called meditation. We're not really meditating then, are we? We're also judging, somehow executing what is there. And somehow, by the same mysterious process, standing out and estimating what is going on. The Mundaka Upanishad will tell us this. It will tell us Brahmevadam Amritam Purastad Brahma Pasheda Brahma Dakshinatas Kotarin Adaskardam Cha Prastam Brahmevedam Vishwamidam Varistam. That supreme principle, which is Brahman, truly is this immortal. In front is Brahman. Wherever you look is Brahman. Behind is Brahman. This reminds me of the prayer of St. Patrick. And St. Patrick simply puts Christ there. Christ before me, Christ behind me. Brahman is to the right and to the left. It spreads forth below and above. Brahman indeed is this universe. It is the greatest. With this attitude, we can see how profound Sri Shankaracharya was, and also how, in his own way, profound and rebellious, and how what a social reformer, because in Ramanuja's social reform, there was no caste. Anybody can join as a Vaishnavite. And then we see in Mark's Gospel how he puts some basic facts down, putting Christianity on a new footing, a revolutionary footing that acts as a basis for all the other Gospels. And so these threefold celebration, I thank you. Shanti, 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 peace, peace, peace be unto all. But the earliest Gospel is Mark's Gospel. You know, there are 4 Gospels. And so people take it Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We used to have a poem like that when we were young, you know. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John went to bed with their trousers on, something like that, one foot in and one. I don't know exactly how it goes. But the assumption is that Matthew's Gospel comes first, and it doesn't. So from a scholarly point of view, Mark's Gospel is the basic Gospel. And Matthew takes it, and where he doesn't like Mark, because of awkward passages that contradicts the developing theology, then Matthew then changes some things. Luke just drops it completely. But each one is appealing, is sending a different message. And by the time we come to John's Gospel, we're not interested in human birth at all. We're interested only, in the beginning was this cosmic mind, this word that became flesh and dwelt amongst us. But actually, historically, Mark's gospel, it was written maybe, I don't know, about 50 or 60 AD. It was certainly the earliest. And the other synoptic gospels will take that basic Mark, and they will also take another text, which the scholars call Q, and they don't exactly know what it is. It might be the Gospel of Thomas. It might be the sayings of Jesus that they take. I don't know. It's just speculation. But these two sources combine. And when we say Mark, well, most scholars will say this is just tradition because we don't know who wrote these texts. We're just giving a name, that's all, to make a connection. Remarkably, the earliest Christian texts are the letters of St. Paul. And I think there are 14, if my memory serves me correctly, but I think only 7 of his are authentically from him. You see, there are texts that people say were written by Shankaracharya, let's say, and probably not. There were people who were sympathetic to his way of thinking and so on, and they would have taken notes. And if you want your notes to be enduring, then you'll attribute it to somebody famous like Shankaracharya, say. It doesn't invalidate the text by any means, and it doesn't invalidate the other letters that were written in St. Paul's name, probably. But nevertheless, they are valuable, but there may be some inconsistencies, but we don't throw the whole thing out because of that. Okay, all good. Okay, well, we leave it there. So, Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thanks.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you, Swamiji.